it's been a bit of a shock. However much one tries to prepare oneself for something like this, it's still a dreadful shock, and we're sort of trying to come to terms with that. And it's very, very sad.
Prince Edward, long viewed as the most reserved and steady presence within the British royal family, stunned the nation when he broke decades of silence during an emotional interview that left the entire United Kingdom reeling. For the first time, he revealed the private battles that had shaped his life behind palace walls, exposing the deep wounds created by years of constant comparison to his brother and the heavy expectations placed upon him from childhood through adulthood. His confession was not dramatic or sensational, it was quiet, raw, and painfully honest, which only amplified its impact. Viewers later described the moment as watching a man finally step out of a shadow he had lived in for over 60 years, allowing the world to see just how much strain the past few years had placed on him. Public reaction was immediate and intense. People who had barely noticed Edward before suddenly began revisiting old footage of him at state ceremonies, family gatherings, and charity events, comparing the composed figure they had grown accustomed to with the vulnerable man now speaking openly. Many said they noticed a sadness in his eyes that they had never bothered to look for, realizing how invisible he had been despite a lifetime spent in public view. As the youngest child, he was rarely the center of attention. He followed the expected path Gordonstown like his brothers, history at Cambridge, but he remained the dependable one, the quiet one, the royal who never invited scandal, never chased headlines, and never demanded space. Experts often described him as the family's silent engine, always running in the background while others generated storms, conflicts, and publicity. Seeing this normally unshakable figure tremble, even slightly, pulled at the nation's heart, leaving many to wonder what internal battles he had been fighting all these years, and what finally pushed him to reveal the truth. The royal family has always included louder, more visible personalities, but it is now clear that something had long been building quietly inside Prince Edward. Though he continued performing his duties with his usual steady energy, a subtle change in his posture suggested a deeper shift. Sources close to him noted that he had been increasingly worried about Queen Elizabeth II, having grown up watching her withstand the immense storms of leadership with unwavering composure. As the child closest to her, Edward had admired her lifelong dedication, over 15,000 official engagements and unwavering service, well into her 90s, and tried to mirror that consistency, seeing it as both strength and duty. Yet the more he attempted to honor her legacy with the same firmness, the heavier that example began to weigh on him. On the day she died, as the United Kingdom entered more than 10 days of national mourning, and nearly 250,000 people queued to see her lying in state, Edward quietly promised himself that he would hold the family together in whatever small ways he could. But as the months after her passing unfolded, the cost of that vow settled into him like a quiet ache. He woke each morning feeling as though something precious was slipping through his fingers, and he could not find a way to stop it. Making matters worse, the unity the Queen had maintained for decades began to fade almost immediately. It started subtly: fewer family photographs, fewer joint appearances, less communication across the branches of the family, and those around the palace noticed that the warmth she carried into every room was gone. Without her, disagreements felt heavier, and emotional distances grew wider. Edward watched tensions deepen between Charles, William, and Harry. Manageable differences hardened into more serious divides, and public surveys showed growing distrust in the brothers' relationship. Meanwhile, Charles faced his own challenges as he tried to guide the monarchy through an era of fewer working royals and rising demands for transparency. Each man battled his own storm, and those storms together created a tense atmosphere that Edward quietly absorbed day by day. He never argued, never chose sides, he simply took it all in, letting the weight gather inside him. More closed doors, more carefully timed entrances, more measured conversations began to turn the palace, once a home, into a place that felt more like a museum, where everyone avoided disturbing the silence. What Edward struggled with most was not the public pressure, but the private emotional distance. He moved through rooms that still echoed with memories of laughter, while the present air grew heavier and more tense. He often looked at portraits of the Queen and felt a mixture of comfort and pressure, remembering her calm ability to unite people, while questioning why he could not recreate that same harmony. That quiet question became the seed of his breaking point, not an explosive collapse, but a slow internal shift. And what many people overlook is that Edward's current emotional struggle is not an isolated moment. Its roots stretch all the way back into his childhood. This is only the beginning of the story of Prince Edward's upbringing and the forces that shaped him. During his early years, Prince Edward was the quiet child of the royal household, overshadowed by louder personalities and clearer destinies. Charles, the heir everyone watched, and whose confidence carried her through any room, and Andrew, who drew attention without effort. Edward sensed very young that he was different. He did not fight for space, preferring instead to sit back, listen, and observe the world as it moved around him. People mistook this for shyness, but it was really a deep sensitivity he never learned to hide. He noticed things other children ignored: the uncomfortable shift in a person's posture, the fatigue in the staff's eyes after long days, the way his mother carried her crown with regal balance that concealed its weight. He paid attention to moods, silences, and small details no one expected him to remember, habits that shaped him into an observer rather than a performer. His closeness to the Queen grew naturally from this sensitivity. She understood that he was built differently from the others, and he often felt she could see the confusion inside him, even when he said nothing. When palace life felt heavy with expectation, he stayed near her because she filled rooms with warmth and steadiness. In an interview, he once shared that Queen Elizabeth had told him she knew he saw the world differently, a comforting sentiment, though even as a child he sensed that such perception could be both a blessing and a burden. As he grew older, the question of where he fit into the royal order became harder to ignore. The hierarchy was clear. Charles was the future king, and had carved a fierce identity, and Andrew attracted constant attention. Meanwhile, Edward often felt like an extra piece in a set that already looked complete. He did not want to compete, he wanted to find a lane that matched the way he saw life, but defining that path proved more difficult than most realized. His struggles were quiet rather than dramatic. At 20, he attempted to join the Royal Marines, but left after 4 months, a decision critics mocked harshly, even questioning his stamina. A few years later, he ventured into television production with Ardent, only to become the subject of media jokes when the company struggled with ratings and drew criticism for filming near Prince William at university against palace guidance. Every headline chipped away at his confidence, and although he tried to move forward, the sting of public judgment settled deep inside him. Then came Sophie, the unexpected turning point in his life. She understood his gentleness and gave him something he had rarely known: emotional safety. She saw him not as a background royal, but as a man deserving space, and when more than 200 million people watched their 1999 wedding, he remained calm only because she stood beside him. With Sophie, he found balance, purpose, and a life where his softer nature could breathe. Together they supported charities without fanfare, making meaningful changes away from the spotlight. People noticed how he relaxed around her, and even his siblings recognized how she allowed his true self to emerge. Still, the comparisons never ceased. Charles, now the monarch, carried the weight of hundreds of engagements and the spotlight of the crown, while Edward continued his steady work in the background, often overlooked and judged through the harsh lens of public scrutiny. The insecurity never controlled him, but it surfaced whenever cameras pressed too close or comparisons grew sharper. He wished people understood that quieter royals carried responsibilities too. Everything changed with the death of Queen Elizabeth. Sources described how her passing reopened every dormant insecurity at once. She had been the one person who understood his softness as a strength rather than a weakness, and losing her felt like losing the anchor that had steadied him since childhood. Her funeral, watched by more than 4 billion people worldwide, overwhelmed him not only with grief for her, but with the sudden, destabilizing question of who he was without her presence. After her death, emotions he had buried for years rose back to the surface, and the cost of royal life, which he had learned to swallow since childhood, returned with force he could no longer suppress. It wasn't fear or anger, it was pressure. And that pressure reached a breaking point during a recent private meeting called by King Charles. There was no ceremony or grandeur, just a quiet room that smelled of polished wood and old carpet. The scent that reminded Edward of long hours walking palace corridors as a boy, quietly observing life around him. The stakes were high as public concern grew. The royals needed to show unity, but the room was thick with frustration that settled on Edward's shoulders even before the meeting began. Charles opened by emphasizing unity, discipline, and the need to avoid missteps that could leak into public view. When William spoke, he echoed the same ideas: appearances, restraint, perfection. Edward listened, recognizing in William's words the same family conditioning that prized image over peace. Harry was absent, and though no one acknowledged it, Edward felt the weight of that silence. Everyone in the room knew that a piece of the family was missing, and Edward could see the worry etched across Charles's face. Harry's absence made every remark about unity feel like an intentional falsehood, stirring a deep unease inside him. Then came the moment that shattered the calmest part of Edward's restraint. Charles stated, calmly and matter-of-factly, that some royal relationships were beyond repair, and the words hit Edward like a physical blow. He felt the air shift around him, something inside him answering with a quiet, sudden snap. For years he had been the silent observer, carrying his inner storms with controlled dignity. But this declaration coming from the head of the family felt like a final abandonment of connection. A statement that some bonds were no longer worth nurturing or protecting. An urgent need to respond rose inside him. And in that moment he did something that stunned everyone in the room. He stood up and spoke openly about emotional honesty, insisting on the importance of acknowledging feelings instead of burying them under the family's relentless pursuit of perfection. He criticized their obsession with appearances and reminded them that it often came at the cost of genuine human connection. For the first time in his life, Edward openly challenged the family's rigid structure and the emotional coldness that had shaped their interactions for decades. Witnesses later said Charles's eyes widened, William straightened sharply in his seat, and Camilla briefly turned away, uncertain how to process the breach in protocol. But Edward continued, speaking of the emotional toll of palace life, the pressure to act perfect while feeling deeply unwell inside. The years spent watching the family fracture in silence. The longing for warmth and closeness that always seemed just out of reach. When he finished, shock hung heavily over the room. Even Charles, usually a commanding presence, looked genuinely taken aback, while William, so controlled and composed, could only stare. Camilla seemed caught in the moment, struggling to mask her reaction. Edward hadn't meant to strike them so deeply, but the truth had been waiting too long to be spoken, and once it escaped, he couldn't take it back. Overwhelmed, he slipped out of the room and wandered the corridors in a daze, barely noticing staff as they moved diligently around him. His mind churned with tension, fear, and relief, liberated by the honesty he had finally voiced, yet terrified by the fracture he had exposed. As he wandered, something unexpected caught his eye, a letter lying on a desk inside a quiet room. The thick paper and precise handwriting were unmistakable. It was his mother's. He had seen many of her letters before, formal and dignified, but this one was different. It was deeply personal, addressed not to a title, but to a son. As he read, her presence washed over him. She wrote about the importance of protecting the heart of the family, reminding him that unity was more than public appearances. It was about emotional connection, about the courage to see and understand one another fully, even when it was painful. She reminded him that strength was not only found in composure or perfection, but in empathy and honesty. Her words reassured him that she had trusted him with something vital, something no one else seemed capable of holding: the emotional fabric of the family itself. She acknowledged the fractures, the distance, and the complexities of their relationships, urging him to be a bridge, a quiet, steady presence who could soften where others had grown rigid. In that moment, Edward understood that his sensitivity had never been a flaw. It was the very thing his mother believed the family needed to survive. The letter made Edward pause, grounding him in a stillness he had not felt since the Queen's passing, and he realized that his challenge to the family, the words he had dared to speak aloud, were only the beginning of a much longer journey. Protecting the heart of the family, as the Queen had urged, was not a single act but a continuous, patient effort requiring resilience, courage, and sensitivity, a responsibility far more complicated than he had ever acknowledged. Yet her letter provided a quiet, undeniable direction. The meeting had exposed fractures, tensions, and absences that could no longer be ignored, and his own voice had finally broken the silence that had defined the family for decades. Slipping the letter into his pocket, he decided it was time to confess an admission he knew would shake the nation. During a recent documentary celebrating Queen Elizabeth's life, Edward entered the studio composed on the surface, though Sophie sensed the storm beneath and gently reached for his hand. As the cameras rolled and lights flickered, the interview began with light questions about the Queen's achievements, questions Edward answered politely, though his strained voice betrayed the tension clinging to him like a second skin. Then came a more personal question about her life behind the public eye, and after a brief pause, Edward dropped the bombshell. He described an intimate, unguarded conversation he'd had with the Queen near the end of her life, one of those rare moments where her fears, hopes, and wishes broke through the formality of monarchy. She had entrusted him with the task of preserving emotional connection within the family among her children, her grandchildren, and the institution as a whole, asking him to guard not just its image, but its heart. As he recounted her words, decades of emotion surged to the surface. He confessed that he felt he had failed her. Tears slipped down his cheeks as he spoke of fractures in the family, the silent wounds created by duty and expectation, and the unspoken longing for warmth that had once defined their home. He reflected on childhood evenings spent quietly with his mother, watching his siblings navigate triumphs and failures under public scrutiny, while he remained the observer, proud yet isolated. He admitted that the monarchy often relied too heavily on perfection, flawless displays, polished dignity, unshakable composure, when perhaps it was time to embrace humanity instead. Edward revealed that vulnerability held its own kind of courage, that honesty had value, and that imperfection did not diminish duty, but gave it meaning. Through tears, he shared his vision for the future, a monarchy grounded not in optics or ceremonial grandeur, but in empathy, communication, and genuine connection. He acknowledged he had not yet fulfilled that ideal, but his confession was a first step toward healing, toward rebuilding bridges, toward reclaiming the warmth that had once existed. As the cameras captured his raw emotion, Sophie squeezed his hand, anchoring him with quiet support. The studio fell silent as his words settled, resonating far beyond the room and touching viewers who had never imagined seeing a royal stripped of pretense. When the interview concluded, Edward felt a subtle shift within himself. The confession had not solved every problem or healed every wound, but it had opened a door for truth and dialogue in a family where silence had long been the unspoken rule. For the first time in decades, he had spoken openly, and the weight he carried began to lift, even if only slightly. The journey ahead remained uncertain, the storms within the family still simmering behind palace walls, but he had taken the first courageous step. Thank you for staying with us. Do you think Edward was right to confront King Charles? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoyed the video, like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Click the next video on your screen for more.